Before thinking about what decolonising the curriculum means, it's probably helpful just to think a little bit about what the curriculum itself is and what we mean by the curriculum. And I think it's important to distinguish between the formal curriculum, the academic knowledge that's embodied in academic programs in universities and schools and other educational institutions, and what's also known as the hidden curriculum, which are the implicit, tacit norms, values, behaviours that exist in institutions, rules that govern people's behaviour, may be explicit or implicit. So I think both of those understandings of curriculum are important when we think about the concept of decolonising the curriculum. At its simplest, decolonising the curriculum really refers to the process of making the curriculum more diverse and representative of different cultures, languages, identities, and histories across the world, both in the global north and the global south. So when we think about decolonising the curriculum, I think what we're really talking about is the Eurocentric nature of the curriculum, the extent to which it's affected what Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the South American sociologist, describes as epistemicide, the extent to which it's undermined other cultures, ways of knowing about the world. And, you know, for some anti-colonial activists, such as the psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, for example, this had an enormous impact on the sense of identity that people of colour have. They become alienated, really, from their own cultures and traditions, and they develop an inferiority complex as well, because you know the world is made to be seen as is represented as having been made by white men, essentially, and so as not being representative. And that idea was taken up by activists such as Steve Biko, the idea that, you know, the Eurocentric nature of education was part of the oppression that black South Africans, in his case, experienced under apartheid, that the curriculum didn't represent black South African cultures, identities, histories. And so it developed in black South Africans a sense of inferiority, and there he's drawing on Fanon. So what does decolonisation mean in practice? What are examples of decolonisation, of decolonising the curriculum? That's a good question. And I think that there are different levels at which we can think about it. So in terms of the formal curriculum, I think it's recognising diversity in the curriculum, whichever subject area you're teaching in, to recognise the contribution of other cultures, civilisations in developing what we understand today as dominant, powerful knowledge, whether that's in literature, the works of great black and brown literary figures over the years, but also science, subjects such as science, the enormous contribution that Islamic civilization and African civilizations, Chinese civilizations have made to the development of modern science, both before the Enlightenment in the so-called European Dark Ages, but also subsequently. So it's partly about that. It's partly about reflecting in the curriculum that diversity, recognizing that enormous diversity of contributions by other cultures, making sure that, you know, in representational terms, that you know, we draw on examples from around the world, that we don't just think about science as something that's applied only to in Western contexts, but to draw on examples from elsewhere in the world. But there are also issues to do with the hidden curriculum, talked about before, the implicit norms and values that are often evident in institutions. There are things like, for example, making sure that the teaching force is more diverse and representative. I think one of the burning issues for many students, both here in the UK and in countries such as South Africa, is the underrepresentation of black and minority ethnic staff in institutions. So I think that's that's an important issue. It plays out in other areas too, such as research. To what extent does research really involve black people and people of colour in the research process? To what extent is it really oriented towards the improving the lives of people of colour, either here or in other parts of the world? So I think those kinds of questions are also pertinent when we think about decolonising the curriculum. In 2016, South African students protested en masse against the presence of a statue of Cecil Rhodes on their campus at the University of Cape Town. Cecil Rhodes embodied British imperialism par excellence. I mean, he was really the archetypal imperialist. One of his most famous quotes was, "I would annex the stars if I could," and of course, he was very much complicit in the establishment of the British colony, the expansion of British imperialism and colonialism in southern Africa, and for many black students, that represented that proved to be very, very challenging. That in the post-apartheid era, where we're trying to move away from colonialism and imperialism, here was a statue of Cecil Rhodes on their campus. So that, if you like, is an example of the hidden curriculum, that a university could have that kind of statue very prominently, reflecting a particular set of values. And of course, it wasn't just the statue. I mean, there are other examples, pictures, other statues, textbooks, the kind of examples that are used in textbooks, the extent to which black and brown faces are represented in textbooks. All of these kinds of things are examples of the hidden curriculum. In schools, the way that teachers relate to black students, for example, if for many black parents and black students, they feel that they're treated unfairly, that when behaviour management policies are applied, that black students are treated unfairly, they're more likely to be excluded from school. I think sometimes it is quite simplistic to think in terms of the global north and the global south. I mean, I think the issue here is that the disciplines, as we know them, emerged largely during the European Enlightenment, although they've been developed subsequently, globally. But that is their origin. And of course, the European Enlightenment coincided with the period of colonialism, with European colonialism. So I think what we saw then was the spread of the Western episteme, ground base of knowledge, represented through the disciplines across the world, both in trade and commerce, in the ways of doing trade and commerce, and other kinds of practices, but also, very importantly, in education. Education was a key vehicle for spreading a Western ground base of knowledge, if you like, a colonial curriculum. And the way that schools were set up in Africa and Asia and elsewhere was very much based on European experiences, so that children in Africa would learn about Shakespeare and Dickens, which at an abstract level may be of interest, but then there wasn't any kind of effort really to promote African and Asian thinking within the curriculum. It was very much a Eurocentric curriculum, and I think that long legacy is still very much with us. It's not just in schooling either. It's reflected in universities as well, in the way that disciplines are taught at university level. And I think that's one of the things that the why is my curriculum white and the roads must fall movements have really protested against. So I think that the point of reference here really is colonialism. It's about obviously the extent to which in countries that were formerly colonized, the curriculum is still dominated by Western thinking, Western thought, but also the extent to which people whose heritage lies in the former colonized countries that have now migrated and now have made Britain, Northern Europe, North America their home, the extent to which their identities, their histories, their experiences are represented in curricula here, in the so-called global north. So it's more complicated than a simple north-south division. It's to do with the post-colonial condition, if you like. Well, I think the Western tradition has become very, very entrenched. It's linked very much with dominant Western interests in the way that, for example, science and technology have been developed and financed and funded, and research has been funded and so on. So I think there are enormous challenges about reorienting research to try and make research more relevant to human development more broadly, not just to particular Western and capitalist interests. I think that there are also challenges in the extent to which people don't want to or are afraid to change. And, what people sometimes object to the idea of changing the curriculum because they sometimes equate it with watering down the curriculum. And I think we need to look at that quite carefully as an idea, because I think actually what people who are interested in decolonizing the curriculum are often referring to is making it more representative, more diverse, enriching the curriculum by bringing in other ways of knowing and understanding that can also help us in assisting, that can also assist us, in solving some of the global challenges that we're facing today. So I think, overcoming those barriers, overcoming the barriers that prevent people of colour, people from the so-called global south, from getting into positions of power and authority in institutions, in the university, and to become researchers in a way so that they can then orient the research towards the interests of people of colour, both in the global north and the global south. I think this is a big idea in education for two main reasons. The first reason is that I think it's part of the zeitgeist at the moment. I think whether you look at the University of Cape Town, student movements there, the Roads Must Fall movement, whether you look at the Why is My Curriculum White movement, which is based in Africa and other parts of the global south, but also in the global north, in universities such as Bristol, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of London, and so on. So I think, young people, students, are really challenging the colonial legacy of the curriculum. So I think we need to understand that and respond to that. But I think it's also critical because I think if you look at at Western knowledge now, if you take Western science, for example, I think we can really see that it is in crisis in many respects. It's brought us enormous benefits in the world. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's try and, Western science has been enormously important in terms of improving the quality of people's lives. But it's also led to many of the global challenges that we face today. Everything from global warming to pollution to the nuclear threat. And I think, that I think putting so-called Western knowledge into conversation with other kinds of ways of thinking, of knowing, of understanding the world, including indigenous cultures around the world, that have a more holistic understanding of what it is to be human, of the relationship between human beings and the environment. I think developing those kinds of conversations, what Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the South American sociologist, talks about epistemologies of the South, bringing those in a way that can enrich our human understanding, our understanding of the kinds of challenges that we're facing as a race, as the human race. So I think asking what schools, colleges, universities can do is a really important issue, because it's one thing to talk and critique, it's another thing to actually think, well, what can we actually do about this situation? So I think it's a really fundamental question. And I think there are lots of things that can be done. In some senses you could say it's a big issue, it's a bigger issue about what these institutions can do, because it's to do with the nature of knowledge itself and the way that knowledge is produced. So I think there are issues to do with the extent to which research is oriented towards, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, realising the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that is beneficial to the whole of humanity, rather than serving narrow interests. That actually, for example, in Africa, that African universities, are empowered to undertake research that's of relevance to the African continent, eliminating the scourge of malaria, other kinds of diseases, and developing technologies that are relevant for Africa and for African development. So I think that there are those bigger issues about orienting research, because of course the curriculum draws on research. It's made of research. But of course the curriculum itself is a selection. It's a selection of knowledge from all the possible kinds of knowledge that are available to humankind. It represents a selection. So I think at a national level, where curricula are often designed for the school system, say, it's about making selections about what constitutes important, valuable knowledge. I think within universities, universities are very influential in setting the knowledge agenda, if you like, because it's through university research that the disciplines are defined. And so I think universities can also do a lot more in making their own curricula more representative. So I think understanding it systemically is important as a system issue, linking processes of research with the processes of curriculum production, and thinking about how then institutions themselves can play a role in implementing the curriculum in a way that's relevant to the background of their learners. About selecting examples that can help to illustrate the curriculum, that can draw on the experiences and backgrounds of the learners that they teach. But I think there are also issues to do with the way that universities and schools are staffed. I think that there can be greater efforts to try and diversify the teaching force, which I think would help enormously in helping to make the curriculum, what's taught in schools, appear more relevant to learners from different kinds of diverse backgrounds. But there are also things to do, for example, in universities, of increasing access for students, not just in undergraduate, but in postgraduate courses, where we're training the next generation of researchers. So I think there are very tangible things that universities and schools can do. No, I don't think that decolonizing the curriculum implies the rejection of universal knowledge. I would perhaps suggest the opposite, in fact, that actually the contemporary curriculum, whether we're talking about the UK or whether we're talking about the world at large, actually represents a pretty Eurocentric view of the world, both in terms of what's taught and what's considered important. And I think, you know, what's important here is the idea of pluriversity, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos describes it, the idea of bringing different knowledge, ways of knowing into conversation that can enrich the curriculum, that would actually enrich our predominantly Western understandings of the world and lead more to a universal idea of knowledge.